Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Justice Sotomayor, before President Jordan introduces you, the committee thought that you might like to know a bit about this area, especially the Latino history of where we are. So I'll make a few brief comments about that. I should say that in addition to Metropolitan State University of Denver, your presentation is co-sponsored by the Center for Colorado and the West at the Auraria Library. And the center has done an excellent job of compiling that history and really presenting a great deal of the history of Latinos here. And of course, El Centro Su Teatro, which you just heard, has a book out of their performance, Where the Rivers Meet, and it is available and it gives an excellent history. So where we are now, this area is called Auraria, and this is where the indigenous Cheyenne and Arapaho camped for a good part of the year, as well as the Ute. It was an ideal place for them to live because the Cherry Creek on this side and the Platte River on this side, just a few blocks each side, provided all of the water, of course, that they needed. And that is where, in fact, that is why, of course, we are here also. That's why we live here also. Unfortunately, you know, Latinos in Denver are considered to, and in Colorado, are considered to be a recent immigrant population. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, they were here. They were here before Denver was established. For example, in 1857, there were some prospectors in the Platte River just a couple of miles from here, and they discovered gold, 1857. That got back east, and that is why the large part of the population from back east moved here and established Denver in 1858. There's a long history there, but I'll really move up very quickly. So the Latino population, the point is that the Latino population has been here since they've been here, well, of course, since 1857 at least. And importantly, when the Mexican Civil War began in 1910, from 1910 to 1920, moving out of Mexico, the railroads merged in the El Paso area, and there were three main railroad routes coming out of El Paso into the US. One went to Chicago, one went to Los Angeles, and the third went right here to Denver. And in fact, Union Station is just 3 or 4 blocks from here, so the Mexicanos would come up, those who came into Denver, and land literally just a few blocks from here, including, by the way, my father and my aunt and 2 aunts and an uncle. And they moved into this area. And so that is why this area became a heavily Latino population. And then in 1965, when this area was going to be developed as a campus, that population was forcibly removed, and that in fact was part of the songs of Su Teatro that we just heard. So when they began to be forcibly removed from here, there was a great deal of resistance against that. And that has really been a legacy for us since then. That resistance eventually did not prevail, and the campus was built here. But we like to think, and we realize actually, that this continues to be a heavily Latino population because of these institutions, because of the Community College of Denver, Metropolitan State University of Denver, you see the banner back here, and the University of Colorado at Denver, all of which do our best to continue to bring back, to reunify essentially that population with the institutions presently. So that is why we are here today. In fact, 4 days ago, the asset bill, our version of yes. Our version of the DREAM Act was signed by the governor in a building just 2 buildings from here, Metropolitan State University building. So now undocumented students will be able to receive in-state tuition. And I think that's that is a perfect example of the continuation of the history of Latinos in this area. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen Jordan, President of Metropolitan State University of Denver. To introduce Justice Sotomayor.
Thank you, Luis. And where is Tony Garcia? Tony, muchas gracias to you and su teatro. Thank you so much for that performance. And again, it's really important for us to recognize our co-sponsor for this event, the Center for Colorado in the West at the Auraria Library. Let's give them a hand as well. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this extraordinary event, this celebration of education and the great American spirit. Tonight, we'll hear from U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor. Whose love of books, learning, and social justice helped propel her against all odds to the highest court in our nation. From a tough childhood in the Bronx to Princeton and Yale, to her years as an assistant DA in private practice and through judgeships in the U.S. District Courts and the United States Courts of Appeals, to become the first Hispanic Supreme Court Justice. Justice Sotomayor has consistently demonstrated that grit, hard work, and fairness can make a life and a society better. Her story, which she has told so eloquently in her book, My Beloved World, will not be unfamiliar to many of you here in the audience this evening. Her American journey is reflected in the stories of countless MSU Denver students who come to our classrooms working multiple jobs, differently abled, balancing children, the psychological ravages of war, representing the spectrums of diversity, hope, and hard work that make our imperfect, remarkable United States of America a place where Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, and Vietnamese, and Ukrainians can come to dream bigger and to see their lives transformed by education. Justice Sotomayor's American journey is also reflected in the life of Golda Meir, a Ukrainian immigrant to this country who in the early years of the last century developed a love of literature, art, and politics here in West Denver, and would go on to lead the State of Israel. At MSU Denver, we use the word scrappy to describe this kind of determination and resilience that we see in our students. I would venture to say that the late Prime Minister of Israel and Justice Sotomayor have lived the spirit of this adjective as individuals emboldened by challenge who nonetheless set about building purpose-driven lives. So tonight, I am honored to have the opportunity to present the Golda Meir Center for Political Leadership Award to Justice Sonia Sotomayor. So it is now my pleasure to turn over the stage to our moderators for this conversation with Justice Sotomayor, Deputy Provost for Academic Affairs, Dr. Luis Torres, and Polly Baca, former state senator and longtime friend of justice, who was instrumental in making this event happen. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the evening with Justice Sotomayor.
know that I met Polly when I was a baby, right? It was more than 25 years ago.
Yes, both
And
of
I
you
met-
have known each other for quite some time.
And as a result, I got to know Colorado and Denver. And I got to know a lot about the spirit of this state and the beauty of it as well. And I've been eternally grateful. I'm even more grateful tonight. President Jordan, the center, all of the affiliates who have made tonight possible. Thank you. This is an extraordinary welcome by an extraordinary city. And I'm grateful for all of you making this happen. Thank you. Thank you.
And of course, thank you so much for taking time to come visit with us, to visit with the students who are up above here. And we're extremely grateful.
You have very enthusiastic students. You do. You do. A lot of energy.
Yes.
Justice Sotomayor, of course, Colorado and Denver love you. And I know many of you have read her book, right? How many have read her book? How many are going to buy her book right after this? We'll be selling it right outside. So, and it's an incredible book. It is wonderful because in this book, Justice, you share your soul and you share who you are. And I know when I read it, I was so moved and I was just amazed at the challenges you've confronted. You know, as a child, you had childhood diabetes. You were in poverty. You had an alcoholic father who died early in life and were raised by a single mom, you and your brother. And so you faced an enormous number of challenges. And I know folks here would like to know, what is the courage within you that, and those personal characteristics that helped you not only meet these challenges that were with you from being as a child, it helped you excel and become a United States Supreme Court Justice?
Your question, Polly, assumes something that I don't think is true.
And what is that?
That there's something special about me.
Oh, we all think you're special.
No. Thank you.
We do.
But you know, I talk a lot in the book about why I wrote the book. And one of its most important reasons was from the day the president nominated, I said a line that some of my friends disputed during my speech, where I said I'm an ordinary person who has been blessed with extraordinary experiences. And people poo-pooed that and said to me, oh, no, somehow you're very special. Mm-hmm. And I would say to them, no, I'm just like everybody else. And I wrote this book talking about the challenges in my life, hoping that everyone who read it would see a little piece of their own lives in my book. Yes. And in my life story. And I wanted every child, young adult, and even older adult who read the book to come away at the end saying just one thing. I'm just like her. And if she could do it, so can I. And so, what are the ordinary things that cause my success?
Yes.
First of all, it was recognizing that every single human being in the world has people around them, even if it's not their immediate family, because sometimes it's not. Mm-hmm. Some kids come from families that are really tough, And you can't deny that. But in everybody's life, there's someone, and often someones, who love you and help you. And if you can come out of your sense of despair and look around and find the joy in knowing that there are people who care around you, they can give you the strength to do the impossible. And that's what I talk about in this book, about the people in my life, my father, who had a very serious drinking problem that made our family very unhappy. Grew up with fighting. I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room that know that life. And even if your parents don't drink, sometimes they do a lot of fighting. I've had a chronic disease, juvenile diabetes, and I've had some close calls with it in life. I lived in poverty. But through all of that, and through all the flaws of everyone, myself included, they gave me love. And that is the quality that I think moves you to success. The moment that you can be humble enough to say, I'm not in this alone. There are people around me who are in it with me. And I can be grateful for that. And the way I show my gratitude is, in real life, not letting myself down. It's not about letting them down. It's about not letting yourself down. And what that means is not giving up. Being knocked down as many times as people want to knock you down, and getting up and trying again. Because from every failure, I've learned something. And my book talks about the things that I've learned from my failures. And I try to do it honestly so that everybody who read it could look at their own life and say, okay, what have I failed in? And why did I fail? And what can I do to get around that? To do something else? And so I don't think of myself as special.
But there was something different about you, and as compared to your cousin Nelson.
You'll learn about my cousin Nelson. You'll learn that he and I were inseparable as children. There are pictures in my book. I'll tell you the story about, can I take a small digression?
Please do. It's okay.
When the White House called me that they were considering my nomination, they asked me to ask my family for pictures of me when I was a kid. So I called my mother, and my mother says to me, Sonia, I have no pictures of you when you were a kid. You know, when I moved to Florida, I lost the suitcase with family pictures. So I asked her to call the family, and they gathered together a few pictures. And so I thought there were no family pictures. I'm writing my book. I go to spend some time with her, and we're talking about the stories and the family stories. And I have a friend with me, and the friend is listening to us. And at the end, just as I'm about to leave the house to go to the airport, my friend says, I would love to see a picture of Abuelita and Sonia's father, because I've heard so much about them today that I would love to see what they look like. And my mother looked up and said, oh, I can show you. And I looked at her and I said, how? And she said, I have albums.
Oh, no.
And she went into a closet that I've seen in her dining area from 20 years that she's been there. I had never looked in there. She climbs up on a ladder and she starts pulling out these photo albums.
Oh my goodness.
And they're most of the pictures that you see in the book. And they were pictures of my family when I was a child, and of my mother and my family when they were young. There's even a picture of my father when he was 2 years old. And one of the most extraordinary moments of writing this book was going back, because I had to catch a plane, remember? I had to go back to get the pictures.
Oh.
So I went back to get the pictures, and on the wall was a picture of my brother and I when I was 3, he was 1. That has been hanging on the wall ever since any time I can remember. I took the picture down and I wanted to include it in the book, and I took it out of the frame. And lo and behold, on the back of the picture was my father's handwriting.
Oh.
And it was dated October 30th, the year after my brother was born in 1958.
My goodness.
And he was saying that it was his dear son's first birthday, and how happy he was with me, his daughter, and his loving wife. And he was wishing us an eternity of happiness. I had never seen my father's handwriting.
Wow.
And I now have that in the back of that picture.
That's beautiful.
But the moral of that story for you kids, when you talk to your parents and ask them to look for something, ask them a second time.
That's great.
All right, going back to your question, okay? Among the pictures in the book are pictures of me when I was little with my cousins. And in every single picture, the person next to me is a little boy, and that's my cousin Nelson. We were soulmates. We were never apart. We did everything together. Everything together so that I talked him into putting his brother on his shoulders. I put my brother on my shoulders, and we played nights on horseback with our brothers, with me a mop and him a broom. Well, guess what? His brother broke his leg. My family never forgave me for that, okay? But Nelson, coming from the same family I did, as loved by his family, because it was my family, as I was, he turned to drugs in high school. And at about 28 years old, he died of AIDS from his drug addiction, from needles. And it was a heartbreaking event for me. So, how did I end up on the Supreme Court? And how did Nelson not live? I don't really have a complete answer to that. I do know that some of it was that the streets are harder for boys. When you're a girl, you're protected by your family more, at least in the Puerto Rican culture. I couldn't leave the house without an aunt or an older cousin. But Nelson was let out as a boy, and so the streets were harder and the temptations more. But I think in the end, he told me the answer. He said, Sonia, as smart as I am, Nelson was brilliant. He was smarter than me. Just before he died, he said to me, Sonia, you have an ingredient that a lot of people don't pay attention to, and it's drive, perseverance, the ability just to keep trying. And he says most people give up. And I've often thought about why people give up, and I think one of the reasons is that they let fear conquer them. See, because failure is painful. And people get embarrassed and they walk away. I guess that I am just so stubborn that even when I'm embarrassed and even when I'm truly afraid, and I'm afraid a lot, I just won't let it conquer me.
That's great.
I throw myself in and I keep trying. But that's something everybody can do. It's something that you don't need a special skill for, Holly. Everybody is afraid. And fear doesn't kill you. It embarrasses you sometimes. It can be painful a lot, but it doesn't kill you.
That's right.
And so the trick is really recognizing that and saying to yourself, even if it hurts, I'm going to keep trying.
That's great. You know, I think that's a message everyone here will hear and does hear.
Well,
Thank you.
From President Jordan, from the kids that you got here, I suspect I'm talking to the choir. They already know that, because I met a bunch of you, and I know that you're working hard at what you're doing, and I'm really proud you're trying.
Thank you. Following along those lines, you discuss in your book about your diabetes, and I know this is a personal, very personal matter, but we thought we would ask about that and how that has been something you've been able to cope with and perhaps overcome. As you mentioned, you had child diabetes. You contracted it when you were 8, and it has been with you, needless to say, all of your life, and you discuss it quite a bit in your book. It keeps coming back, as I'm sure it does every day for you. You discuss it, for example, the morning of your wedding. You almost have to remind yourself to give yourself an insulin shot, and at times you go into crises because of the diabetes. Following along the lines of Polly's question, how have you been able to cope with that and yet achieve the remarkable success that you have?
You know, there's a lot of people who live with chronic childhood diseases. As many, and I'm sure there's a lot of people in this audience who have lived with juvenile diabetes. And I'm sure there's a lot in this audience who are living with adult diabetes. I'm sure there's a lot of kids here with asthma, and that they're kids with other chronic diseases that they have to pay attention to every day. And I had a 6-year-old child at a juvenile diabetes conference get up, this little girl, cute as a button. And she got up to the microphone, and her question to me was, does it ever get easier to live with diabetes? Question broke my heart. And it broke my heart because I realized that I had lived this 6-year-old's life, that I had lived struggling to understand the disease that sometimes seemed to take over my life, that it was bigger than me, and sometimes made me feel as if I didn't have the energy to do all the things I wanted to do. And disease is challenging. But at that same conference, another young woman got up and asked me another question. And I found the answer that I think is the right one. She asked me, is there anything good about having diabetes? And I said, yes. It teaches you to know your body, and it teaches you discipline. And in the end, if you figure out that you have value as a person, it teaches you to like yourself enough to take care of yourself. Isn't that strange to say? Most people think that diseases are such bad things because they do something to you, instead of thinking about them as giving you the opportunity to love yourself, to like yourself enough to take care of yourself. You know what diabetes requires? Exercise. Everybody in this room should be exercising. It requires you eating healthy. Everybody in this room should be eating healthy. All right? It requires moderation in the things you do. Everybody should be doing that. And why don't we do it? Because we don't care enough about ourselves to do it. And if you become a controlled diabetic the way I have, you figure out, you know something, I'm worthwhile. I can take the time to figure out what my body needs and when it needs it and why it needs it, and how to take care of myself by checking my sugars and taking my shots, and how to keep on top of eating well and healthily. And I don't say that I always exercise when I should exercise, but I do a fairly decent job of it most of the time. Sometimes work takes over. So, how do you live with a disease? You embrace it as part of you.
Wow.
And you accept it as a gift, as something to teach you how to live better and how to appreciate living more. I value life so much. I take every minute of every day and squeeze as much out of it as I can. You should see my schedule the last day and a half. All right? And I push myself only because I want to get as much out of life as I can. And my diabetes taught me that.
Thank you.
So it's not the challenges we face, but how we respond to those challenges.
Exactly.
And you certainly are a role model for doing that. And also, Justice, you come from or your family is from the island of Puerto Rico. And that island is, I'll bet there are some Puerto Ricans here.
Hey, I
can
hear
tell
some
we've got
out there.
Familia out there. And throughout your book, you talk about Puerto Rico. Many times you refer to it. And it seems as if there's still a calling from the island. And you even end your book with a poem about Puerto Rico. So what is that calling, and what does the island of Puerto Rico represent for you?
You know, it was interesting when Luis was telling me the history of Colorado and explaining that Latinos were not immigrants, that they were here before Colorado was a state. The rest of you migrated. And one of the purposes of my book was to introduce the United States, the mainland, and the world to the island of my parents, and to explain to them that Puerto Ricans are not foreigners. Do you know how many people ask me whether I have a Puerto Rico passport or a US passport? Oh, no. All right, it was strange, isn't it? Or they call Puerto Ricans immigrants.
No.
I mean, Scott Pelley, who did a beautiful interview with me on 60 Minutes, introduces me as, my family as immigrants. And I'm sitting there in a group of friends and I say, we're migrants, we're not immigrants. But the point is that when you come from a place that's different than the place you end up in, you always start out feeling like you're an alien. If you grow up in a Spanish-speaking household the way I did in the Bronx, where the people in your school, the people around your neighborhood dominate a language you don't understand, you do feel alien. And it takes a very, very long time to call that place your home. And what you start with as home is your family. And it's the culture that your family teaches you. It's the music you listen to. It's the food you eat. I talk in my book about the poems that I heard as a child. Both my father and my grandmother loved reciting poetry. And so they, even though I wasn't born there, even though I wasn't being raised there, they taught me about what being Puerto Rican was. And I think some of you may have already heard me in other places say, they taught me how to be a proud American with a Puerto Rican heart.
There you go, absolutely.
And that's what all immigrants and migrants to America are. We are people who have become vibrant, giving parts of the American tapestry. We have built this nation, whether it was Latinos, Asian Americans, Russians, name the group, Italians, Irish. Every ethnic group who has come to this country has become a part of its fabric. And yet, we've brought with us our food, our dance, our music, our poetry, our literature. And we've shown others in this country the richness of that. And so, for me, it has been the journey of being gifted with having become an American and knowing another culture at the same time. And what a treasure that is.
Oh, that certainly is.
It is. I find it hard. You know, when I was a district court judge, I used to swear in the new citizens once a year. And I would always tell them, you have an obligation. You have an obligation to teach your children about this country. And at the same time, not let them forget about where you came from. Because they can have both. And so this book was intended to give people a sense of how those worlds come together. Of how I could be born in the Bronx in New York and be a Bronx kid and at the same time be a Puerto Rican child.
That's fantastic. That is great.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question about the role of law, and who better to ask, right? We have many students here who I'm sure are interested in going into law, and whatever.
I met a few of them earlier.
There you go, right? You discuss it, actually everyone who is interested in the law and going into the law, and a lot of other people also should read your book, but especially those who are interested in the law, because it is, I mean, you of course discuss it a great deal. I should say, by the way, the book is in Spanish also, Mi Mundo Adorado. So read it in both languages, right?
Do you know that the book came out the same day in both languages?
Really?
Which is
Oh,
unheard
really?
of.
That's remarkable.
Wow, that is,
That's remarkable.
It is a tribute to my publisher,
Yeah, great.
who, when I asked them whether it could be done, with great effort and tremendous dedication of resources, they made it happen.
Great.
I was editing the book until a week before it went to the printer.
oh my goodness.
And some of that editing was because I had friends who know my voice and who speak both languages, who were helping with the translation and into putting the Spanish into my voice. Because as some of you who speak two languages know, literal translations sometimes lose the sense of an original. And I can tell you, because I was told by a very famous Spanish television personality, Jorge Ramos, that the book is a Puerto Rican voice.
That's good.
All right?
Very good, that's great.
But the effort was my publishers and my friends, because it was important for someone who started to speak English first, to speak Spanish first, me, that coming out in both languages was an important statement for me
Sure. Yes.
and about this book.
That is wonderful.
In fact, I'll get back to the question of the law, but you could almost take the first half of the Spanish book and then the second half of the English book and put it together, and that's almost a reflection of your life.
Absolutely.
You say in the book several times that, of course, you spoke almost only Spanish at home. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Right.
When I went to school, my first 4 years, and I describe it in the book, I was a CD student. And I realized that most of it was a product of not really knowing what was going on in the classroom. It was not until 4th grade, and part of it the result of my father's death, and my finding books as an escape, that I really began to understand enough English to go to the top of my class. But that took that sequence of events for me to start mastering English enough to become a better student.
Very similar experience, by the way, my experience with yours, about learning Spanish first and then later learning English.
I bet that this audience is filled with a lot of
Right,
kids
sure.
who have done that.
But about the law, you say, for example, through the law, you could change the very structure of society and the way communities functioned. So it's a broad question, but can you give us some examples about how law has changed the society in this way? I mean,
There's one-
no, there are many.
The one example that I cite always, and some kids have asked me today, what's the most important Supreme Court case? Legally, there are Supreme Court cases, and the first is Marbury versus Madison, which was one of the earliest cases in our nation. And it was the case that established the importance of the judicial branch in the American Constitution. It's the case that announced that it was the courts who would decide whether a law was constitutional or unconstitutional. So in terms of history, legal history, that probably is the most seminal decision in judicial history. But the one who changed the lives of every single person in this room was Brown versus Board of Education. Brown was decided on May 25th, 1954. I was born 1 month later. June
Wow.
25th. My life, the fact that I'm here today, is a product of the seed that that case planted in the American structure. It struck down segregation. And that one case started a chain reaction of structural changes in the way America existed. Not only were schools integrated, public transportation was integrated, so was public education, every aspect of our society. Today, we accept as a given the concept of equality under our Constitution, and that's the product of that one case. Now, I called it a seed because the actual change started with that case, created the thread, but it didn't happen integration, the creation of a more equal society, just because the court said it would happen. It happened because leaders like Martin Luther King, Chavez,
Caesar.
the other civil rights leaders who marched on Washington, who led the charge through the civil rights bills, who continue to advocate for the equality of all people. It happened because people became involved in taking charge of our society. And that's the message I deliver every time someone asks me, how do you feel about this law? And I tell them, you know, I really can't tell you how I feel about a law because I'm a judge and the law may come before me. And I don't want people to believe that I've made up my mind on whether the law is constitutional or not before I've heard the case. So I think I set a bad example if I tell you how I feel. But you know what I tell them? It's not really important about how I feel. What's important is how you feel and what you're doing about those feelings. Are you participating? And how are you participating in making your community a better place? Because laws don't just happen. People pass laws. And so if you want us to be a more equal society, you have to do something about it. You have to become involved members of your community. And there are so many ways to do this. I don't think change comes just from the law. It's the way I've chosen to participate as a citizen, as a caring person. But I think people change their community by joining school boards, by participating in their local civic activities, by simply volunteering at a hospital and sitting and reading to people who are sick. In every way that you give in your community, you better your community. But the only thing is that you have to understand that that's your obligation. It's your obligation as a human being. It's your obligation as a caring person. And it's a civic responsibility. If you want to live in this society, then you have to be a part of it. And you should try to be a good part of it.
You mentioned the state legislature, and we just gone through an historic legislative session. We passed
you know I'm not going to
incredible
comment
bills.
on that.
I know. But I'm just so proud of the legislators. There are some legislators in the audience, and I think they deserve a round of applause for the work they did this past year. So instead,
She's the politician, remember that?
so instead, though, I've got another question for you. And, 4 years ago, you were my friend, Judge Sonia Sotomayor.
And when
And
you
then-
introduced me, you used to call me Sonia, and tonight
Yes.
you called me Justice.
But that's because you are a justice now. And, it'll be 4 years. You're coming up to your 4th anniversary of your appointment. And maybe you could share with the audience, what it felt like. I mean, or how your life has changed, I might say, since President Obama called you in New York and said, Sonia, I would like to appoint you to the United States Supreme Court. How has your life changed, and how do you feel about that? And tell us the process. What happened?
When the president called me, I was at home.
Yeah.
And I picked up the phone, and the White House switchboard operator said to me, this is the White House, please hold switchboard, please hold for the president.
Interesting call.
It's a very interesting call. And my heart started to beat. It was beating so loud that it was beating in my ears, and I was afraid he could hear the beating. As soon as he said his words, I began to cry. His words took my breath away in a way that you can't describe except for somebody who doesn't cry that often, and I don't cry that often. It just filled me with emotion. I had a sense that my life would change, but no matter how much you think it'll have change, until you live it, you don't know. The next day, because he called me on Monday night, I drove to Washington that night in the rain. And as 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm working on my speech in the car while my friend is driving. And I look up, and I'm headed to Betty and Alex's place in Virginia.
Betty's my sister.
And I've been to visit them, and I'm on 395, and for those of you who don't know Washington, 395 is from Washington into Virginia. So we had passed Washington. And I look up and I say to my friend, we're going away from Washington, not towards it. And he realizes that his GPS with the storm had gone out of order.
Oh, no.
So I'm calling friends to guide me, I had a friend in California who I knew was awake at 2 in the morning, and I called her to get on the computer and give me directions back to Washington.
Oh, my goodness.
It's good to have friends across the country, okay? And it still was a little unreal. It became more unreal the next morning, because I go to the White House, and I'm brought into the executive building, and I'm introduced to the First Lady's hairdresser and makeup guys. And I'm sitting there like a little princess being made up. And the last time that had happened was at my wedding. And that had been 30
That was
years
a long
before,
time
okay?
ago.
At any rate, I sort of, you're watching people, they're all moving around, everybody's doing things. And all of a sudden, the press communications director gets up and says, okay, I have to leak the story. And I looked at her and I said, I have spent a month keeping the secret that I was being looked at. You told me not to tell anybody. I kept my word. I come here in secret during the night. You put me in a room under a different name, and now you're going to leak it? I I was, it's like, what are you doing? And she says, we're making the announcement at 10 o'clock. This is the time to get the buzz going. We want the press there.
We saw it on CNN.
Exactly, okay? And so I said, oh boy, I've just got into a new world altogether, okay? They finish with that. I go in the back of the East Conference Room area. There's my family. And there come the president and the vice president.
Oh, wow.
And the president is talking to my nephews about soccer. And the vice president is talking to my brother about golf. And I'm standing there thinking to myself, I really am in a fantasy, okay? I'm still asleep dreaming. They empty the room, and I'm there with the president and vice president, and we're just chit-chatting, and all of a sudden we start walking into the conference room. And they have very, very long legs. If you haven't met them, they're really tall.
Yes.
And they were moving much faster than I was, and I whispered, please, stop. And they turned around, just presidents on the left, the vice presidents on the right. They turned around and they smiled at me. From that moment, my emotions, my spirit left my body. And I began to look at myself from outer space. I was like that for about a year and a half. I used the word catapulted because it was more like being jolted into a world stage. And I think my first impression had always been, yes, a lot of people in the United States will know who I am. I had not realized that everybody in the world would know who I was.
That's right.
All right. I remember being called and receiving emails from friends all over the world telling me they were watching the hearings on television. I got to throw out a first pitch at Yankee Stadium.
For which you practiced weeks.
I practiced for weeks. I'd never thrown a baseball. My brother was the jock. I wasn't. And so every afternoon for 15 minutes, I would go into the Supreme Court courtyard area, and I would throw a baseball. I got quite a reputation in the courthouse. I couldn't throw it from the mound, don't have a strong shoulder, but I threw it right down the middle, just off to the right corner, but a strike. It's been overwhelming. You lose every sense of privacy that you ever thought you had. You know, it's hard to tell people what it's like to be in a restaurant, take a fork to put it to your mouth, and you stare at the person across the way who has a cell phone over the top of the table to take a picture of you as you're putting the fork in your mouth. Or what it's like to go home, as I did last year or the year before, and be on the street with a friend who was helping me prepare a party for other friends. And we're talking about what we're cooking that night, because she was going to help me with the cooking. And we're discussing how to cook chicken sausage, okay? And there's an internet article the next day that I'm on the street arguing with a friend about how to cook chicken. Who cares? Why would you care? And why do people find it necessary to invade your privacy? But they do. And there is a sense of loss and I tell school kids this all the time. I used to value being able to sit in the back of the room and to listen and watch. Today, everywhere I go, I'm in the front of the room. And there is a sense of loss of the person that you are and of privacy when that happens. You're given a different gift. You're given the gift, as I have, of doing a job that I could only have ever fantasized about doing, of being a part of conversations, of votes that become history. To be able to do that, I've given up a lot of who the private Sonia was. And now I've invited that even more by writing a book. But the book had a purpose.
Yes.
And that purpose was so that every kid who read it could say what I started with. If she could do it, so can I.
That's right.
And so this has been worth it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I very much regret to say that we will have to close now.
We've talked for an hour.
Yes.
We've talked for an hour and a half.
More
it
than an
looks.
hour, yes.
Wow.
So on behalf of everybody here and on behalf of the university and the Center for American West, and for all of us, thank you so much for coming. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you all for being here. I truly appreciate it.